Good morning, everybody. This is Morgan Denny coming to you from Portland, Oregon, and today we are going to talk about one yoga pose, downward dog. I'm going to warn you right off the bat, I am not a yogi. I'm not a guru. I know some about yoga, but not a whole heck of a lot. But I still think it can be an important piece of your practice as a PT, so I wanted to talk about it a little bit today. Because I really think that yoga can be for everyone when done appropriately, and it can be really important for us as PTs to take a step back and understand. When patients come to us, and this will happen, and they have actually hurt themselves during yoga, and I don't know if maybe it's because I live in Portland, Oregon, or because of other reasons, but I've definitely seen my fair share of patients who have come to me because they've hurt themselves during different poses. That can be cervical spine, shoulder, low back, hips, you name it. But patients certainly get hurt doing yoga. But it's not because yoga is bad or dangerous or scary. It's because people are people and they tend to mess things up sometimes. So it's important for us as PTs to certainly understand a little bit about yoga practice, or at least understand some of the poses so that we can use this thing that have injured some of our patients in order to actually help them heal. Right? If patients are coming to us and they already have this established practice, it's a lot easier for us to modify what they're already doing, help them engage certain musculature or turn on muscles in certain areas or during different time frames of movement in order to maintain that practice and keep consistent with that instead of trying to reinstate our whole new exercise program. So when patients come in and are already doing yoga, or have injured themselves doing yoga but are, really passionate about it, there's no reason for us to take that away from them, but to understand some of those poses and positions more appropriately can really help us to help them along the way a little bit faster, right? So, plus you can use it as one of your treatment goals, because I know that I initially as a PT would write, hey, I want to return this person to their yoga practice 3 times a week, blah, 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 with 1 out of 10 pain, etc. I'm sure that was a super smart goal. Anyway, but I didn't really know enough about each of the poses in the practice, so I fumbled through. But the further I've gone along the chain and the more I've learned about yoga or gone to a yoga class and realized from the PT's perspective all the little pieces and nuances that can go into that, right, that can really help us along the way. And so now I've realized some of the details that really can make yoga a very helpful thing for our patients, and also that have allowed me to understand enough to instruct patients in changing what they're doing to be more helpful for their body and also for their practice. So I think that I want to talk today about downward dog, because downward dog seems to be one that a lot of different people out there know about. Most people are aware of what downward dog looks like, and in yoga practice, it's often the pose that is come back to time and time again, is used as a resting position, is used to gain stability, endurance, that sort of thing. So for those of you out there who don't know what downward dog is, number one, there's always Google Images. Go for it. But number two, let's talk a little bit about it. In downward dog, patients have their hands and their feet both on their ground, and basically their butt is in the air. In a perfect world, their body is creating kind of an equilateral triangle of sorts. They have 180 degrees of shoulder flexion, hands are up overhead, palms are firmly on the ground, elbows are extended but not hyperextended. Basically, the apex of the triangle is created mostly from hip flexion and less from lumbar flexion. Spine is fairly neutral to maybe mildly extended. And in a perfect world, the knees are straight and the feet are flat on the ground. I will tell you that's not what my downward dog looks like. For me, my ankles are floating off the ground. My knees are slightly bent. And there's a little bit of fight to get my shoulders in that position, but it's a great pose. So that's kind of what the pose is supposed to look like, basically like a triangle. Again, Google Images, it's amazing for all this stuff. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how this pose can be used really effectively for our patients, right? So who out there has ever seen a patient who has low back pain and they've got crazy stiffness in their hips, right? If you're not raising your hand, you're probably not looking. These two go hand in hand. I wouldn't say there's a correlation or causation, but it's there, people, right? If you can't move through your hips, then every time you bend, sit, lie in the fetal position, whatever it is where you need flexion, the body is basically compensating for the hips by overflexing the lumbar spine, right? So downward dog can be a really good position for people who kind of have these matching attributes, because downward dog, at least when cued correctly, forces the person to create that apex of the triangle with their butt up in the air, using hip flexion primarily. And in order to hold that neutral spine position, they're having to activate lots of core muscles, right? Who's seen a low back patient, then they ask them to activate core muscles more appropriately? Probably everyone out there, right? So using this pose to kind of cue people to gain hip mobility while they stabilize the spine is a super awesome piece to this. But if you think about it, if you take your triangle, your downward dog, and you flip it one direction, hopefully it's the direction I'm thinking of, you end up in a long sitting position with an overhead reach, right? That is basically creating a ton of mobility along the posterior chain, which helps with a lot of our low back patients who suffer, or I don't want to say suffer, but who have pain when they sit a long time, right? Who lack flexibility through that posterior chain. So using downward dog can not only help their body to gain strength in downward dog position, but if you think about it, it functionally translates into sitting in other positions as well. So if we move up the chain a little bit from the lumbar spine, who's ever seen a patient who has thoracic stiffness? I mean, kind of one every 30 minutes in the clinic, Monday through Friday, right? A lot of people have got that thoracic stiffness going on. It's almost a disease as bad as gravity. But anyway, so downward dog, again, when cued correctly, you can get people to utilize the position to really get some movement through their thoracic spine. When I have patients in that position, I will ask them to either take their sternum and push it towards their knees or towards the ground, kind of depending on where their flexibility lies and where they're starting. So downward dog, you can use to cue some thoracic extension. Extra bonus points is that downward dog also uses 180 degrees in a perfect world of shoulder flexion. Now, how many people out there have ever seen a shoulder impingement patient or shoulder whatever patient who one of their primary components is that their thoracic spine doesn't extend, right? Ribs don't move, scapular girdle doesn't move, nothing moves, so shoulder is basically compensating and gaining too much mobility at the glenohumeral joint because nothing around it is doing its job. Super common. So here's a pose, here's a position, an exercise you can teach patients that not only gains thoracic extension at the same time that it asks the person to try to gain up to 180 degrees of shoulder flexion, but in this position, because you are pushing the ground away and working into that high level of shoulder flexion, you're engaging lower traps, you're engaging serratus anterior. Now, how many shoulder patients have we seen that have weakness in their scapular girdle? Again, a ton of them, right? So this pose, when people can tolerate it, is a really effective way of gaining some of these end range positions and really working a person into utilizing mobility in the right planes while stabilizing in other planes, okay? So now if we move down the chain, right, or to the lower extremities, obviously we're looking at anything that we could mobilize in the posterior chain. The hips, the hamstrings, the fascia, the calf muscles, the ankles, you name it, it's a pretty good stretch. Now, I want you to keep in mind that when you're creating this stretch, you're also stretching the nervous system and you are really, really tensioning it. So while this position could actually be really good for gaining some of that neural mobility, for patients who are more highly irritable, you might want to start somewhere else, right? And while yoga is for everyone, there are going to be people that you have to modify it for. Or there are going to be people where you need to start a lot more slowly, right? So for example, that patient that comes in who has nerve involvement in whatever their diagnosis is that you come up with in the clinic, if they have a straight leg raise of 20 degrees, downward dog is probably not the place to start, if their symptoms are super irritable. If they're not, then, you can kind of play with it or you can modify it in order to get into it. But if you put that huge tensioning stretch on a patient's nervous system right off the bat, they're probably not going to be super happy with you, right? But using this pose to kind of gain some of that mobility can be really helpful as well. If you think about it, downward dog kind of helps you to multitask, right? So many people come in and they've got stiffness in certain planes and they're bound up along nerves and whatever, you name it, or they've got poor mobility in one place and they've got a lot of mobility somewhere else. Oftentimes this can kind of match with what downward dog teaches. So as long as we understand it and we can use it more appropriately and cue it appropriately, then we can really help patients make a change with this one. Keep in mind also that some people are going to start in different places. So if your patient comes in and they can't even get into quadruped, you probably don't want to put them in downward dog either, because not only are they not going to succeed, you're probably not going to be able to get the gains you want or cue it appropriately. So keep in mind that downward dog, while in yoga is considered a very basic move, clinically it may not be the appropriate place to start, but it could be a really good place to gain or to work up to, basically. Now, there's no law about how long you hold said pose or how many repetitions you do. Just like in many of our PT exercises, there's going to be some variability based on patient irritability, et cetera, but depending on how the patient is presenting, I will often have them kind of do a pumping movement in and out of the exercise. So depending on if you're trying to gain, knee extension with dorsiflexion, you can have them be in downward dog and kind of like pump their heels up and down off the ground to work into it. If you're working on thoracic extension with shoulder flexion, you can have them work on the control of scapular mobility, working in and out of thoracic extension, particularly if you find that this person is moving in the wrong place. It's good to back it up and just kind of work into it a little at a time, because if they're not able to complete it appropriately or get the stretch where you want it, then you don't want them to hold this pose for 60 seconds, right? But people who can get into the pose appropriately, who can find those muscles the right way that kind of help whatever their issue is, it's good, have them hold that pose for 60 seconds 3 or 4 times. It works on endurance, which is generally what we need in those postural muscles anyway. So I think this one can be really, really helpful, not only for some of that retraining, but, for your athletes, for your grandmas, for just about anyone, right? It's good to be able to give something that not only multitasks, because it's great to provide one exercise instead of 4, but also to be able to use something that's generally known and accepted in society. Plus, as bonus points, you never know. The person might turn into the next yogi, and that might become a practice that keeps them healthy for the rest of their lives. So keep in mind that some of these yoga pieces, especially downward dog, can be really helpful for your patients. All right, that's it for today. I know that's not a ton of detail, but I think it's a really good place to start. So I challenge everyone to go out and try a little bit of downward dog, whether it's for yourself or for your patients today in the clinic, and hope you have a good weekend. Oh, the song of the day is Lebanese Blonde by Thievery Corporation, and I will post it below on the Facebook. All right, peace out, everybody.